Political consequences of hermeneutic communism. By this, of course, I do not mean that the book, our book, or our thesis has actually had consequences beyond the fact that it's been translated into about 5 languages and there's a big book being done now on the book, but that I'm not referring to that. What I am referring to is that hermeneutic communism takes as a model, as an example, what has been going on in South America since the 1990s, more or less. In other words, all those social movements that have left or become parties, very strong parties, like from Bolivia to Venezuela, and also actually even Brazil, because Lula's party was actually part of a social movement at the time. So that's what inspired or took as a model. One of the things that our political book has done, contrary to others, for example, Negri and Hart or many others, that we do not believe in abstract metaphysical notions as empire or multitude, which, if you really think about it, where is the empire? It's just a very, very vague notion, and even the multitude is not very clear where it is. For anyone who reads the book would be very surprised to find that we think instead of empire we should use the word IMF or WTO. We should be very specific on what the problem is. There is no need to go to be abstract and use words as empire or so forth. And this has also consequences, because at the end of the book, the third, fourth part of the book, we actually call for to take the South American alternative not as an alternative, like we talk so much in Europe about, but rather as an alteration of what we have. The difference between alternative and alteration, it's particularly important to understand also what we talked this morning about, the possibilities of overcoming metaphysics, or basically overcoming any sort of a frame. It's not possible, at least not to the degree that one completely overcomes it. That's the difference between alternative and alteration. What is possible is to make an alteration of the things we had, or even from the ideologies to a big shock. After all, when one has a psychological problem, like I mentioned this morning, it's not solved through psychoanalysis. It is actually altered. It becomes smaller, but you keep it. It's a little bit like when one cuts itself and has a sign forever. Among the consequences of hermeneutic communism, it's important to recognize that we call for social movements to return or to become a party. Every time I give talks at the New School, everybody gets very angry because over there everybody has been going crazy with the Occupy movement. But I don't really think that. I think it's great, of course, but at the same time I'm not so sure that that's actually what makes the difference. In South America, what made the difference is that this social movement have all become political parties, and very strong political parties with very charismatic leaders. And actually, if you think about it, one of the big problems we have in the European Union is that there aren't any charismatic leaders. There's almost nothing. There's almost a sort of technical, mechanical thing going on there, and that's actually one of the problems. And so what happens with Podemos or Pope Francis? Podemos hasn't really left the social movement, but has created an alteration of the social movement, and has created such a big alteration. By the way, Podemos, all the members from Pablo Iglesias to Gerjón and Monedero and everybody who has actually constructed Podemos, they are all fans of South American politics, of Chavez, etc. That's why, of course, one of the biggest tools they use in Spain to denigrate them is to say, oh my God, they want Spain to become Venezuela, or they're populist, etc. So this is already an indication that what we need here is, according to us, is to overcome the social movement, to surpass the social movement into the political representation in the state. This can have very big consequences. We consider that the biggest political revolution that had taken place, at least in the past 20 years, have been done through parties that have left social movement. Today, there is no bigger, even today actually, not only when they did it in the 2002, I think, no bigger emancipation one can create rather than to lead the IMF, for example. Who has been able to lead the IMF? In Europe, we belong to the IMF, literally. South America most of its countries have left the IMF, have paid the debt and disappeared, and of course grew a lot doing this. You can find all this justifications for all this in the book, with all the quotes from Stiglitz, etc., etc. So this is sort of a fact, even if I don't believe in facts. So this is something very important to take into consideration when one talks about what is to do. This famous question we all want to grab so fast. Instead, one has to be a little bit careful, and perhaps one position, one idea for European intellectuals, or those public intellectuals we referred to before, is perhaps to go and look for a model. And when we talk about what Chavez has done as a model of what we're supposed to do in Europe, it doesn't mean we have to do exactly the same thing. We don't need to do exactly the same things in most European countries. But we might need to plan to do the same things, because unfortunately the European Union, which is basically a small chapter of the IMF, is really throwing us into the situation in which, for example, Venezuela and many other countries found themselves before they elected in a democratic way, of course, Chavez. Chavez was elected several times in a democratic way. I'm sure you're all informed about all this. So another thing here important is to, on the one hand, someone might say now, well, but today the book came out 5 years ago, so now Chavez is dead and there's a lot of changes going on in South America. Fine, but that doesn't mean that, if you look at, there are some very interesting economists like Dean Baker who explained that, well, regardless that now there's a shift to the right, or more left to the right, or there's more, or now finally the United States had decided to go back to South America to bother everybody. This doesn't mean that the work they've done is not valuable anymore. Brazil, Lula has basically has basically eradicated poverty, extreme poverty from Brazil. Not to mention in Venezuela there are no more illiterates, thanks to all the misiones, they call them over there. So this very strong social, and we like to call hermeneutic communism, but we call it like this. It's an indication that, well, Chavez, of course, and all the politicians that did not refer to themselves in any way as neither as socialists actually, but sometimes as socialists, but certainly not as communists. And neither is Podemos doing that. But they all do have in common the idea that, well, one, the social movement has to find political representation through the party in the state, one. And two, that we have to stop being afraid once for all of populism, because one of the things we criticize, at least in Spain and Italy, to the European Union, is the fact that almost everybody's a technocrat there. And they also try to impose on, in countries, especially in Italy. In Italy we had Monti for 6 months, who was a prime minister who was basically a robot. And he lasted, of course, 6 months. People couldn't stand it. So aren't we also, by criticizing this sort of Europe, also in a way calling for populism, calling for a charismatic leader? Of course, Trump is also very charismatic and we don't like him. Fine. But the thing is that, like I mentioned this morning, one has to read very carefully Chantal Mouffe and Nestor Laclau, because they explained years ago, by the way, and that's why now all of their books are returning to, everybody's reading them again, have to take into consideration very carefully the big difference there is between right-wing and left-wing populism. It's not a simple ideological difference, it's actually a difference of enemy. The enemy for Trump, it's so obvious it's the foreigner, while the enemy for Podemos is explicitly the corporations and all those. One of the things Podemos want to change now in Spain is, for example, that we do not allow anymore any deputy or any minister to sit in any in any big corporation as a COE. They don't want that anymore, because of course there's a conflict of interest there that it's judged. So if these calls here are too violent, one has to be also think of, or maybe request that, well, this is also a response to what we find ourselves in now. in a situation where in Europe there is not enough populism. We need more populism. This does not, of course, call for a right-wing populism, at least not on my part, but on a left-wing populism, which is very, very different from what we have, from what the right-wing populisms are. The second example I wanted to take into consideration here is Pope Francis, because he has also been accused of populism many, many, many times, and still is now. And this is also another parallel we must make. How come? Why? Well, first of all, why did the Vatican choose, because they did choose him, Pope Francis? First of all, Ratzinger was supposed to resign 2 years after his mandate instead of his 6 years that he lasted there. And that was one of the things that they were agreed in there. But of course, they tried to keep him as much as possible. But why did the Vatican change so radically and choose someone so populist, left-wing populist as Pope Francis, who, even for people who are not Catholics, as myself, has become a sort of, I wouldn't say idol, because my idols are almost all musicians, so I don't really have intellectual idols. But why does Pope Francis have become so interesting for politics today? Well, in a way, because who is today, because until Chavez was around, he sort of was for many people, not for me, but for many important people like Noam Chomsky or Naomi Klein, etc., sort of the only big charismatic leader on the left on a global scale, a reference, basically. Okay? He dies. Who is the other big reference today in global politics for the left? Pope Francis. He's the big reference today. And he's the big reference not because this, of course, is an idea Batum had a few years ago, and a lot of people now are more or less beginning to maybe you might not agree with it, but one really has to think about who really, on a global scale, can ask demands for the changes he does. It's very difficult to find someone else. And maybe one of these figures today is the Pope, who, of course, is doing this from a very complicated and difficult place. You can imagine working there, it's a very difficult place, but he has done things and he does make calls which, I mean, he's actually the first one, or one of the first ones to have gone against Donald Trump himself. I'm sure you all remember a few months ago how they both clashed against each other. So the idea that the same criticism that Podemos receives of populism, of going too far, of wanting to become a sort of European Venezuelan Chavism, isn't that the same thing that is happening to Pope Francis and has been happening? Well, from a pure media point of view, it is, and it actually is also from a theoretical point of view, I think. So one of the consequences of hermeneutic communism one of the things that changed, but we continue to read in terms of hermeneutic communism, is that, well, both Podemos and Pope Francis, in a way, they endorse that pluralism that I was talking about before, that sort of weak understanding of our subjectivity, together with what? Together with a social distribution, okay, that will refer in the second case, of course, to communism. Now, you ask Pablo Iglesias, are you a communist? He would say no. If you ask Pope Francis, if you're a communist, he would say no. But when they did ask Pope Francis, are you a communist? He said, oh, I don't have anything against other people's ideas. Well, that doesn't seem like saying no, does it? So philosophers have to try, I think, to show or indicate some relation between their theories and perhaps some concrete examples. And the idea that Podemos has come, in a way, the South American model has reached Spain, let's say, reached Podemos, is actually an original idea that actually Tariq Ali had about 7 years ago, when he also called for, he was also a fan of Chavez, who also called and hoped for the South American model to reach Europe. Having said this, I hope to more or less say everything. Let me see. Yeah, I want to hear what you have to say about all